The error message appeared on Derek Williamson's computer screen at 8:43 a.m. on November 2, 2023. Access denied, authorization level insufficient. Contact System Administrator for assistance. Derek was the Chief Operating Officer of Northpoint Medical Supplies, a regional distributor with 412 employees and $97 million in annual revenue. He'd been trying to approve the bi-weekly payroll run, something he did every other Thursday without issue. He clicked refresh. Same error. He closed the application and reopened it. Same error. He tried logging out and back in. The system accepted his credentials, but the payroll module showed a red lock icon with the same message. Derek walked to the IT department at 8:51 a.m. and asked the junior support technician why he couldn't access payroll. The technician checked the system logs and said Derek's access had been automatically suspended due to failed compliance verification. Derek asked what that meant. The technician said the system had flagged irregularities in Derek's authorization level relative to his documented role and had initiated a security lockout pending administrator review. Derek asked who the system administrator was. The technician said it had been me, but Derek had terminated my employment yesterday. Derek's face went pale. I'm Maya Patel, and I'd built Northpoint's entire HR and payroll infrastructure over the past 9 years. I designed the automated compliance monitoring, configured the role-based access controls, and programmed the audit trail systems that tracked every transaction. Derek had deleted my position from the org chart on November 1, 2023, at 3:17 p.m., thinking he was quietly eliminating my role. What he didn't understand was that the systems I'd built had integrity checks that validated all administrative changes against documented policies and employment records. When Derek deleted my role without following proper termination procedures, he triggered a cascade of automated security protocols that I'd implemented specifically to prevent unauthorized system modifications. The system didn't just notice his irregular action. It responded. I'd joined Northpoint Medical Supplies in February 2014. When the company had 180 employees and still processed payroll using a combination of spreadsheets and a 20-year-old mainframe system that required manual data entry for every change. The HR director at the time, Margaret Foster, had hired me as IT systems analyst after I'd spent 6 years doing systems implementation work at a healthcare technology company. Margaret understood that Northpoint's growth was being constrained by administrative systems that couldn't scale. We were spending 40 hours per pay period just processing payroll manually, and errors were common. Margaret gave me a clear mandate: modernize our HR and payroll infrastructure to support growth to 500 employees without proportionally increasing administrative overhead. I spent my first 3 months at Northpoint documenting every existing process, interviewing every person who touched HR or payroll data, and mapping the actual workflow versus what the org chart suggested should happen. What I found was chaos held together by institutional knowledge. 5 different people had partial access to payroll data through various systems. There was no centralized employee database. Benefits administration was tracked in 3 separate spreadsheets maintained by different people. Time and attendance data came from physical time cards that supervisors submitted on paper forms. Nobody could tell you with certainty how many active employees we had at any given moment because the data lived in too many places. When I presented my findings to Margaret in May 2014, I told her we didn't need better software, we needed a complete system architecture redesign with proper data governance and automated controls. Margaret approved a 2-year project to build integrated HR and payroll systems from the ground up. I served as technical lead, working with an external consulting firm to select and implement enterprise HR software, then spending 18 months configuring it to Northpoint's specific needs and building custom integrations with our other business systems. The key design principle I insisted on was automated compliance verification. Every change to employee data, compensation, benefits, or access permissions would be validated against documented policies and trigger alerts if irregularities were detected. Every transaction would create an immutable audit trail. Every administrative action would require proper authorization based on documented roles. The system wouldn't just record what people did, it would verify they had legitimate authority to do it. By September 2016, we'd fully implemented the new systems. Payroll processing time dropped from 40 hours per cycle to less than 6 hours. Data errors dropped from an average of 12 per pay period to less than 1 per quarter. HR administrative costs as a percentage of revenue dropped from 4.2% to 2.1%. We could generate compliance reports in minutes that previously took days of manual work. Margaret promoted me to Director of HR Systems in October 2016 and gave me responsibility for all HR technology, data governance, and process optimization. The systems I'd built became the operational backbone of the company as we grew from 180 employees to over 400. Everything changed in March 2021 when Margaret Foster retired at 67 after 32 years with Northpoint. The CEO, Richard Northpoint, hired Derek Williamson as Chief Operating Officer with responsibility for all operational functions including HR, IT, finance, and supply chain. Derek was 43, had an MBA from Northwestern, and had spent 18 years in operational roles at progressively larger medical supply companies. His most recent position had been VP of Operations at a national distributor with 3,000 employees. Richard thought Derek would bring sophisticated operational practices and help Northpoint continue scaling. I had concerns from Derek's first week. Derek held his first operations review meeting on March 15, 2021, at 9 a.m. in the main conference room. He'd invited all the functional leads including me, the CFO, the VP of Supply Chain, and the VP of Sales. Derek spent the first hour presenting his operational assessment and priorities. He talked about lean processes, operational efficiency metrics, and cost optimization opportunities. When he got to HR systems, he said our administrative costs were still too high relative to industry benchmarks and we needed to find ways to operate with fewer full-time positions. He asked me how much time I spent on actual systems work versus administrative overhead. I said I spent approximately 60% of my time on systems development and optimization, 30% on compliance monitoring and audit support, and 10% on user training and support. Derek said that seemed like we were overinvested in systems maintenance and should look for ways to reduce that overhead. I asked what specific systems maintenance activities he thought were unnecessary. He said he'd need to review it in more detail but generally felt that once systems were implemented, they shouldn't require substantial ongoing investment. I said modern HR systems required continuous optimization, security updates, and compliance monitoring as regulations changed. Derek said we'd discuss it further. I scheduled a meeting with Derek on March 18, 2021, at 2 p.m. in his office. I brought a 30-page document I prepared showing Northpoint's HR systems architecture, the automated controls and compliance checks I'd built, and the specific regulatory requirements we had to monitor continuously. We operated in healthcare supply, which meant we had to comply with HIPAA for employee health data, SOX controls for financial reporting, and various state employment laws across the 6 states where we had operations. I'd built automated monitoring for all of these requirements. I explained that the systems didn't just process transactions, they validated every change against current regulations and flagged potential compliance issues before they became problems. Derek reviewed the document for maybe 10 minutes, then said this was exactly the kind of over-engineered approach that created unnecessary overhead. He said most companies our size didn't need this level of systems complexity. I said most companies our size experienced more compliance violations and audit findings than we did. Derek said we'd discuss it another time. The meeting lasted 23 minutes. Over the next 18 months, Derek made decisions that increasingly concerned me. In May 2021, he eliminated the HR manager position and reassigned those responsibilities to department supervisors, reducing specialized HR oversight. In August 2021, he cut the IT department budget by 30%, forcing us to delay security updates and system enhancements. In November 2021, he implemented a hiring freeze that prevented us from replacing the HR benefits specialist when she left, distributing her work to remaining staff who weren't trained on benefits administration. By March 2022, I was spending increasing time fixing problems caused by undertrained people making errors in systems they didn't fully understand, rather than working on systems optimization. I documented everything in detailed reports to Derek. April 14, 2022, I sent him a 7-page memo explaining that the benefits administration errors had increased 47% since we'd eliminated the specialist position, and that we were at risk of penalties for late COBRA notifications and incorrect tax withholdings. Derek responded that people needed to be more careful and we couldn't afford to hire specialists for every function. June 22, 2022, I sent him data showing that our IT security patch deployment had fallen 3 months behind schedule due to budget cuts, creating potential vulnerabilities. Derek said we'd catch up when the budget allowed. September 8, 2022, I sent him an analysis showing that payroll errors had increased from 0.8 per thousand transactions to 3.1 per thousand, primarily due to supervisors making data entry mistakes without proper training. Derek said supervisors needed to take more ownership of their responsibilities. The situation with the Department of Labor audit in January 2023 should have been a wake-up call. The DOL conducted a routine audit of our wage and hour practices, examining time and attendance records, overtime calculations, and classification of exempt versus non-exempt employees. The audit identified 12 instances over the past 18 months where supervisors had incorrectly modified employee time records without proper authorization, resulting in underpayment of overtime in 6 cases and overpayment in 6 others. The total discrepancy was approximately $8,000. The DOL assessed penalties of $23,000 for record-keeping violations and required us to implement corrective actions. I'd actually flagged most of these errors through my automated monitoring systems when they occurred, but Derek had dismissed them as minor administrative issues that didn't require immediate correction. I sent Derek a detailed post-audit analysis on February 3, 2023. The subject line was DOL audit results, root cause analysis and required system improvements. The memo explained that every error the DOL had identified had been flagged by my automated compliance monitoring systems when it occurred. I'd sent alerts to Derek and to the supervisors responsible. Most had been ignored. The memo included specific recommendations for restoring proper oversight, including reinstating the HR manager role, providing mandatory training for supervisors with payroll access, and implementing stricter authorization controls to prevent unauthorized changes to employee records. Derek responded by email the same day saying the audit was a learning experience and we'd do better going forward, but he didn't approve any of my recommendations. He said we needed to work within our current staffing and budget constraints. What Derek didn't know was that I'd maintained detailed documentation of every compliance alert the system had generated, every recommendation I'd made, and every instance where those recommendations had been ignored. I kept this documentation in a secure archive separate from Northpoint's main systems, stored on encrypted drives in my home office. I'd learned from the DOL audit that when compliance problems emerged, having comprehensive documentation of warnings and recommendations was essential for demonstrating that systems controls were properly designed and that failures occurred due to management decisions to override those controls. The situation deteriorated further through 2023. In April, Derek eliminated the training coordinator position, making it even harder to ensure people understood the systems they were using. In June, he rejected my request to upgrade our HR software to the current version, which meant we were running systems that were no longer receiving security patches from the vendor. In August, he implemented a new policy requiring all system changes to be approved by him personally, even routine configuration updates that were necessary to maintain compliance with changing regulations. By September 2023, I was spending 70% of my time documenting problems and sending alerts that went unaddressed, rather than doing the systems optimization work I'd been hired to do. Derek called me into his office on October 31, 2023, at 4 p.m. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He said Northpoint was restructuring its operations to reduce overhead costs and my position was being eliminated. I asked when. He said immediately. I asked if this was related to my compliance reports and recommendations. He said it was purely a cost decision and nothing personal. I asked about severance. He said I'd receive 4 weeks of severance pay plus accrued vacation. I asked who would handle systems administration. He said they were transitioning to a managed services provider who could handle it more cost-effectively. I asked if he understood that the systems required continuous monitoring and compliance verification. He said the managed service provider would handle it. The meeting lasted 7 minutes. Derek handed me a termination letter and walked me back to my desk. He stood there while I gathered my personal items, which took about 20 minutes. I didn't argue or make a scene. I loaded 2 boxes into my car, drove home, and spent the rest of the evening documenting the termination conversation and reviewing the systems architecture I'd built over 9 years. The managed services provider Derek mentioned didn't exist yet. He hadn't lined up any replacement. He was planning to figure it out after eliminating the position. What he didn't realize was that he'd just triggered every security protocol I'd spent years implementing. The next morning, November 1, 2023, Derek logged into the HR system at 7:52 a.m. and navigated to the Organizational Management module. He found my position in the org chart and clicked the delete button at 8:06 a.m. The system prompted him to confirm the deletion. He confirmed. The system prompted him to enter a reason code and effective date. He selected position elimination and entered October 31st as the effective date. He clicked submit. The system processed his request for approximately 3 seconds, then displayed a message: change request submitted for compliance review. Automated verification in progress. What happened next was a cascade of automated checks I'd programmed into the system years earlier. The compliance verification module detected that Derek had deleted a systems administrator role without following the documented change control process. That process required advance notification to IT security, transition planning for system access transfers, and approval from both HR and the security officer. Derek had done none of those things. The system flagged the change as irregular. It then checked whether there were any other systems administrators on file who could review the change. There weren't, because I'd been the only one. The system flagged this as a critical control gap. It then checked Derek's authorization level to determine if he had override authority for systems administration changes. He didn't. The documented policy required board-level approval for any changes that eliminated the systems administrator role. Derek hadn't obtained that approval. The system's response was automatic and immediate. It classified Derek's action as an unauthorized system modification and initiated a security lockout. At 3:17 p.m. on November 1st, Derek's access level was automatically downgraded from administrator to standard user. His access to payroll, benefits administration, and employee data modification was suspended. An automated alert was sent to the 3 members of Northpoint's board of directors, Richard Northpoint, Patricia Kim, and James Bradford. The alert explained that a critical security event had been detected involving unauthorized modification of systems administration controls, and that administrative access had been suspended pending board review. Patricia Kim called Richard Northpoint at 3:34 p.m. Richard was in a meeting and didn't answer. Patricia left a voicemail saying they needed to discuss an urgent system security issue. She then called me at 3:41 p.m. I was home. Technically unemployed. I answered on the second ring. Patricia introduced herself, though I knew who she was from board presentations I'd done over the years. She said the board had received an automated security alert about systems administration changes and asked if I could explain what had happened. I explained that Derek had terminated my employment and deleted my position without following proper change control procedures, triggering automated security protocols I'd implemented to prevent unauthorized system modifications. Patricia asked if Derek now had no access to payroll and HR systems. I said that was correct. The system had classified his action as irregular and suspended his administrative access pending board review. Patricia was quiet for maybe 5 seconds, then she said they needed to discuss this immediately and asked if I could attend an emergency board meeting the following morning. I said yes. The board met on November 2, 2023, at 7:30 a.m., before Derek arrived at the office. The meeting was held at Richard Northpoint's home to maintain confidentiality. Richard, Patricia, and James were present, along with the company's attorney, Susan Myers. They asked me to explain the system's architecture, the automated controls, and what had happened when Derek deleted my position. I spent 90 minutes walking through everything. I showed them the documented change control policies I'd implemented. I showed them the audit trails of Derek's actions. I showed them the automated security protocols that had triggered the lockout. Then I showed them something else. I showed them 9 months of compliance alerts that my systems had generated and that Derek had ignored. I showed them the 18 instances since January 2023 where supervisors had made unauthorized changes to employee records. I showed them the 14 cases where payroll errors had occurred due to lack of proper oversight. I showed them documentation that Derek had rejected recommendations to address these issues despite explicit warnings about compliance risk. I showed them evidence that many of the problems the Department of Labor had identified in their audit had been flagged by my systems beforehand and that Derek had dismissed them. I showed them that Derek's cost-cutting decisions had systematically dismantled the compliance controls that protected the company from regulatory liability. Patricia asked what would happen if the board didn't address this immediately. I said payroll would not process for the current pay period because Derek couldn't approve it and nobody else had sufficient access. 412 employees would not receive their paychecks on time. I said benefits administration would be unsupervised because nobody had the access or training to perform those functions. I said compliance monitoring would cease because the automated alerts had no recipient. I said the system would continue operating in lockdown mode until someone with proper authority restored appropriate controls. Richard asked what I recommended. I said the board needed to restore proper systems administration oversight immediately. I said they needed to review Derek's operational decisions that had created compliance gaps. I said they needed to determine whether Derek's pattern of ignoring compliance warnings and dismissing security concerns represented acceptable risk management. I didn't say Derek should be terminated. I just laid out the facts and let them draw their own conclusions. The board asked me to step out while they deliberated. I waited in Richard's kitchen for 42 minutes. When they called me back in, Patricia spoke first. She said the board recognized that the systems I'd built were critical to company operations and compliance. She said they were offering me immediate reinstatement as director of HR systems with expanded authority, reporting directly to the board rather than through the COO. She said my compensation would increase to $195,000, approximately 31% higher than before. She said I would have autonomy to implement whatever systems controls and staffing I deemed necessary to maintain compliance, with a restored budget. She said Derek would be placed on administrative leave while the board conducted a comprehensive review of operational decisions made over the past 2 years. I accepted the offer. I restored Derek's basic system access at 9:47 a.m. on November 2, 2023, but with restrictions. He could read data but couldn't modify anything. The board wanted to ensure business continuity while they investigated. Derek learned about his administrative leave at 10:15 a.m. when Richard called him into an impromptu meeting. I wasn't present for that conversation, but I heard later that Derek argued he'd made appropriate cost management decisions and that one compliance audit didn't justify this response. Richard apparently told him the issue wasn't one audit, it was a pattern of ignoring documented compliance risks and dismantling controls that protected the company. The board's investigation lasted 6 weeks. They retained an external HR compliance consultant to review all of Derek's operational decisions related to staffing, systems, and compliance oversight. The consultant's report, delivered in mid-December 2023, was devastating. It found that Derek's decisions had increased Northpoint's regulatory risk across multiple dimensions. It documented 18 specific instances where Derek had been warned about compliance issues and had either dismissed or ignored those warnings. It calculated that the cumulative cost of errors, audit penalties, and inefficiencies resulting from Derek's cost-cutting had exceeded $470,000 over 2 years, far more than the $220,000 in personnel costs he'd eliminated. The report concluded that Derek's operational approach demonstrated fundamental misunderstanding of the regulatory environment in healthcare-related businesses and that continuing his employment created unacceptable risk. Derek Williamson's employment was terminated on December 22, 2023. The board announced it as a mutual decision to pursue other opportunities. Brandon Chen, the VP of Supply Chain, was promoted to Chief Operating Officer with explicit board direction to rebuild operational controls and restore proper compliance oversight. Brandon understood from day one that systems administration and compliance monitoring weren't optional overhead, they were essential infrastructure. We're now 10 months into rebuilding Northpoint's operational controls. I rehired an HR manager in January 2024 and a benefits specialist in February. I restored the IT budget in March and completed delayed security updates by April. I implemented mandatory training for all supervisors with payroll system access in May. Our payroll error rate dropped back to 0.9 per thousand transactions by June. Our benefits administration accuracy returned to pre-2021 levels by July. We passed a follow-up Department of Labor audit in August with 0 findings. In September, I presented to the board showing that our compliance monitoring systems had flagged and prevented 23 potential violations in the first 9 months of 2024, violations that would have cost an estimated $130,000 in penalties and corrections if undetected. My role has expanded beyond systems administration. I now oversee all HR technology, compliance monitoring, data governance, and operational risk management. The board views me as a critical check on operational decisions that might create hidden compliance costs. Brandon consults with me before making any decisions that affect HR systems or processes. That's a significant change from Derek's approach of viewing systems oversight as unnecessary overhead. What's interesting about this experience is how clearly it demonstrates that operational systems aren't just tools for processing transactions. They're control frameworks that embody institutional knowledge and protect organizations from risks that aren't always visible to people focused only on cost reduction. Derek saw my role as overhead because he measured cost without understanding value. He didn't realize that the automated controls I'd built were constantly preventing errors, flagging compliance issues, and protecting the company from regulatory liability. He thought he could eliminate that protection without consequences because the consequences weren't immediately visible. The system I'd built proved otherwise. Here's what I learned from 9 years building HR systems and one day being deleted from them. Systems architecture should embed compliance controls that activate automatically, not depend on people remembering to do the right thing. Derek could delete my position, but he couldn't delete the institutional knowledge I'd programmed into the systems themselves. Documentation matters more than verbal agreements. I documented every warning, every recommendation, and every instance where those recommendations were ignored. That documentation made it impossible for Derek to claim he hadn't been informed of risks. And technical expertise matters more than organizational hierarchy. Derek was COO, but he didn't understand the systems he depended on. When he tried to eliminate the person who did understand them, the systems defended themselves through the automated controls I'd implemented years earlier. I still work late some evenings from my home office, reviewing system logs and compliance reports to identify issues before they become problems. The nature of my work hasn't changed, but my authority has. The board understands now that systems administration isn't overhead to be minimized, it's infrastructure to be protected. They learned that lesson the hard way when Derek's cost-cutting triggered a systems lockout that nearly prevented 412 employees from receiving paychecks. That's an expensive way to learn about the difference between cost and value, but at least they learned it. Derek thought he could make me vanish by deleting my position from an org chart. He didn't understand that I'd spent 9 years building systems that validated organizational changes against documented policies and reacted to irregularities. The day he tried to erase me, the system erased him instead. Not because I programmed it to be vindictive, but because I'd programmed it to be thorough. Sometimes the best revenge isn't personal at all. Sometimes it's just good systems design that activates exactly when it should, protecting institutional integrity against people who don't understand what they're dismantling. Derek learned that lesson on November 2, 2023, when he discovered that deleting a systems administrator is easy, but operating without one is impossible.